All right, it's presentation 5 over Africa. In this one, we're going to look at current issues. So first one's population. So Africa, of course, being one of the poorest areas in the world, is also seeing the highest population growth, and that's a trend that we generally see around the world. Is that the poorest countries are growing the most, which of course puts a lot of pressure on the rest of the world to be able to provide for them. So standard of living in any country, in any part of the world, depends on its carrying capacity. And we've talked about that term before. So it's the maximum number of people a land can support. So looking at food, water, and housing and stuff like that. And a lot of these countries in Africa have reached their carrying capacity to where they're not able to really provide for more people. And we talked about the lack of arable land in Africa as well. And the fact that most Africans depend on subsistence farming, about 66% that we talked about make their money from farming or make their living from that. And so you're not producing enough food for everyone else if everyone, people that are farming can only produce enough for themselves. And generally speaking, most Africans can't even farm enough for themselves, what they really need. And I mentioned before how a third of Africans are living in refugee camps right now because of war and oppression, of course, genocides that we looked at, and all different sorts of things going on throughout Africa. And obviously that puts a lot of pressure on the rest of the world, the United Nations, the United States, other countries to be able to provide, food and just basic shelter for these people that are displaced, because that's over 300 million people in refugee camps. And then as far as what we see, the division between men and women, men usually are out farming, so clearing land, tilling soil, growing crops, and women tend to take care of the home, children, elderly, collect water, and fuel wood. Of course, a lot of the kids help with this as well. But again, because of this, women, don't really have access to education. And it's one thing we talked about when we talked about population way back in Unit 2, was that if women are less educated, then they tend to have more kids because there's just not really that many opportunities for them. And keep in mind too, also with this, that it's you do need, with this kind of standard of living, you do need someone taking care of the house. There does need to be a division of labor somehow. Because in this kind of society, taking care of children when you have a lot of them, and then cooking and providing for your family is a full-time job. I mean, that's sun up, sundown easily. It's not like they have a microwave and some hot pockets they can just heat up. It takes a lot of work. And then the African birth rates, like I mentioned, are the highest, higher than any other part of the world, and which just makes it extremely tough to be able to provide for them. And then reasons for high birth rates. Okay, they're thinking like, okay, if Africa's so poor and they got so many problems, why are the birth rates so high? And there's some cultural reasons for this. So first one is they view children as a spiritual link to the past and future. So it's kind of the way to keep your name going as well. And so that's kind of where they find importance and identity is in their children. And then children are needed to bring in income for the family. Remember, these are subsistence farmers. And so the best way to increase the amount of product you're bringing in is to have more kids, because it's more workers to help you on the farm, especially if they're boys. To combat high infant mortality rates. And of course, like I said, they're looking for at least one son. But keep in mind, about half of the children are going to die before age 5, and so you need to have more kids in order to ensure that some will actually make it to old age. And then childlessness in their cultures is considered a tragedy for most. So you're not really a woman until you have a baby. And so it's a tragedy if you don't. You're kind of more of an outcast as a woman if you can't have kids. And then, of course, we mentioned education. So if there's more education available, then they could make more money and then, of course, have less kids. And then you also have polygamous relationships. That's, of course, where a man has more than one wife. And you see this in some Muslim communities. Men are allowed to have more than one wife as long as they can provide for all of their wives, which obviously is going to increase the amount of children being born as well through that. So here you see a population pyramid of Nigeria versus South Africa. So South Africa, as I mentioned in the previous presentation, has a better economy. And so you can see that in its population pyramid. You still have more kids, but it's not as much. It's not as drastic as Nigeria, where you have a lot of youth and not that many people living to an older age. And then here in these pie charts, we can see the leading causes of death in Africa and in Europe, and kind of compare. So you see in Africa, almost 54% of all the deaths come from infectious and parasitic diseases. Whereas in Europe, that only makes up 2.2% of all the deaths. Whereas in heart disease is the main killer in Europe, followed by cancer. And you see up here, cancer is only 3.8% of all the deaths in Africa. So the environment is totally different, obviously. Living conditions and stuff like that are going to change drastically why people are dying from certain things. And so, like cancer, for example, one reason it's lower in Africa, one, you could say, um, well, lack of, they're not around as many, like maybe chemicals and stuff like that that were around. But the other part is just living longer. I mean, if you live till 80 years old, like, if you have a 50% chance of getting cancer. And a lot of that's just because you live longer, whereas in Africa, they don't live as long to get cancer, to die from that. There's many other things that can kill them before they get to that point. All right, then, well, there we go. Economic development. So most African countries, for the most part, are worse off today economically than they were before independence from European countries. Take Rwanda, for example. The kind of stuff they went through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and still today in a lot of countries has held them back. And then, of course, the other big thing is one commodity countries. Here's all your one commodity countries. I mean, that's a good chunk of Africa. Just focusing on one thing per country to sell. And as you can see, most of these are pretty basic stuff. I mean, obviously, you can make a good amount of money from oil and natural gas if you manage things correctly. But then other things are just going to be like coffee, cocoa, bauxite, diamonds, which obviously that could bring in some money. Live animals, things like that aren't going to do too well. Now, the one good thing we can say is democratically elected governments have spread. So here's your democratically elected governments in 1970 compared to the year 2000. So democracy has spread throughout Africa, which is a good thing, giving more freedom to the people and a better chance of a better life. Obviously, this is just going to take a lot of time. And then, of course, you can look through here and see the HDI rankings of different countries and kind of compare them to the U.S. and Mexico and Japan to give you an idea. Of course, some of these countries are incredibly low. As you go through here, I'm not really going to point any out at the moment, but you can kind of get an idea of where the different countries in Africa are as far as standard of living goes. All right, now things they need to improve their economies in Africa. One idea would be an economic cooperative promoting trade, so something like NAFTA, the EU, so create something like an African Union, economic union. As far as free trade, probably not a currency. That probably would not work because you have some economies that are doing far better than others. But at least creating a free area of trade. No more one commodity countries. So these countries need to diversify and figure out other things they can produce and trade. Education's got to be the number one priority because that's the way you fix everything else. If you don't have an educated working class, then nothing else matters. And then finally, fight the brain drain. You need to know that term, brain drain. And so brain drain is basically where you have intelligent people being born in your country, but they don't stay in your country because of the lack of education and opportunity. So they leave, and then they go to Europe, or they go to the United States, or they go to East Asia, and they go to a better school, get a good education, and then they tend to stay in those places because there's better job opportunities and they'll make more money. And so it's figuring out how to keep your human resources, how to keep those people that could better your country, somehow encourage them to stay there and help their country. All right, then healthcare. Now, you don't need to know like all these different diseases and stuff like that. This is just kind of giving you an idea of what they're fighting. So because of the climate and good chunk of Africa, is warm and wet, in some places just warm, you don't have a winter, therefore you have a lot of insects, which means you have a lot of diseases in these areas. So just kind of give you some examples. You got river blindness, which comes from the tsetse fly. And then cholera. This is bacteria basically in the water. So you get sewage, human waste in the drinking water. Thus giving them cholera. Sleeping sickness. Oh, that's from the tsetse fly. Sorry, I got back. The river blindness is from parasite. There we go. Sleeping sickness is a tsetse fly. So headache, fatigue, confusion, sometimes death from that as well. And then elephantitis, and I know this all isn't there, but you can see it in this photo here. Let me just kind of pull that up. So elephantitis is where blood vessels basically get blocked and fluid builds up in a limb, usually the leg, creating a huge foot like that. And of course, keep in mind, these are things that here we just don't have, partly because of our climate, and then the other part, obviously, is advanced medicine. And then malaria, of course, comes from the mosquito, which kills so many people in Africa every year, and it's easily preventable. Just a little pill every day would take care of that. And then tuberculosis is a lung disease, which can obviously be fatal as well. But the biggest killer in sub-Saharan Africa is HIV/AIDS. So a couple of facts about this. Now, of course, I assume you generally know what AIDS is, and and all of that. Every day in Africa alone, HIV/AIDS kills 6,300 people. So it says that's like an Indian Ocean tsunami every 2 weeks. This is referring to the tsunami back in '04 on Christmas that killed over 200,000 people in that one tsunami. Um, and so, I mean, you keep in mind as far as how this is passed, you do need to know generally how this is passed around. So men a lot of times go and work in other places, so far away from home, and a lot of times they may end up having sex with a prostitute, and they're contracting HIV, and then they go home, have sex with their wife, and then she gets HIV and it passes on to her kids and stuff like that, and it just keeps going. So 95% of all the people living with HIV/AIDS live in the developing world, and 60% of those alone are in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's really concentrated in that region. And a lot of it, too, also doesn't, obviously having sex with prostitutes and stuff like that doesn't help, but also, again, too, just lack of any kind of sexual health, not understanding how diseases are passed, not having access to things like condoms and things of that sort as well to help protect them.